I'd call on the Deputy Leader of the Opposition, the member for Newlands, to grace us with prayers.
Morning, members. Let us pray. Almighty God, from whom all wisdom and power derive, we beseech thee so to direct and prosper the deliberations of the Parliament now assembled, that all things may be ordered upon the best and surest foundations for the glory of thy name and for the safety, honor, and welfare of the people of these islands. Bless our sovereign lady, Queen Elizabeth II, Philip, Duke of Edinburgh, Charles, Prince of Wales, and all the royal family. Give grace to all who exercise authority in our Commonwealth, that peace and happiness, truth and justice, religion and piety may be established among us. Especially we pray for the Governor of our islands, the Premier, the Speaker of the Parliament, the Leader of the Opposition, Ministers of the Cabinet, ex-official members, members of the Parliament, the Chief Justice, and members of the Judiciary, that we may be enabled faithfully to perform the responsible duties of our high office. All this we ask for thy great name's sake. Let us say the Lord's Prayer together. Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us. Lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. For thine is the kingdom, the power, and the glory, forever and ever. Amen. May the Lord bless us and keep us. The Lord make his face shine upon us and be gracious unto us. The Lord lift up the light of his countenance upon us and give us peace now and always. Amen.
Please be seated. This honorable House do now resume its sitting.
Administration of oaths or affirmations.
None.
Reading by the Honourable Speaker of messages and announcements.
Honorable colleagues, I rise this morning to report to this honorable House the passing of one of our former members, one of our senior politicians, and a keen supporter of our Commonwealth Parliamentary Association. Pastor John Delaney Jefferson Sr. Brother John, or Chef John, as he was affectionately known to us, was elected to this honorable House in the general election of 1968. Quite an extraordinary year. Brother John defeated the late veteran, Mr. Spurgeon Ebanks, who was the Deputy President of the House and MLA for West Bay for many years. Brother John won 2 terms, 1968 to 1972, 1972 to 1976. He was an effective MLA, man on the ground, attending the needs of his people in his district of West Bay. Brother John stood strongly at all times for all things Caymanian, not budging on any matter he felt would cause moral decadence of the society and our values. And most certainly, there was no stronger defender of his Christian faith than him. The church was, he felt and declared, the cornerstone of our Christian faith, and it should never be denigrated at any time. Our laws, he felt, must always be consistent and reflect our heritage and culture. Our national life, he felt and believed, should not deviate from our traditions and mores that made Cayman a special place in this world he felt had become chaotic and lost its way. One of the things I most remember was his stance between 1969 and 1972 on the Constitution that we received in 1972. The huge issues of the cadastral survey, because we had no real safeguards in the land registration system existing at the time. The introduction of the cadastral survey resolved most of the uncertainties regarding land registrations. However, there were claims not settled and stayed in government possession and had to be adjudicated on. The other issues of significance that he did not compromise on were the then government's infrastructure program, our road paving network, West Bay to East End, our then new hospital, and the courthouse. This assembly building, now Parliament building, and the then old admin building, or the glass house. Those issues cost him dearly, the loss of his political career. He was smeared, deeply criticized, maligned and belittled and accused because of his buy-in to the vision and the concept of the then government's infrastructural projects. But if we are fair and reasonable, we can say, without the championing of the cadastral system and those infrastructural projects, where would we have been? As one of Cayman renowned chefs, he hired a significant number of women who also honed their skills working with him. Many of the women perhaps might not have had the opportunity to be gainfully employed and do so well working with him. Honorable members, the body of our former colleague will lay in state on Friday, 9 a.m. until 11 a.m. here in this Parliament building. The official funeral services will be held on Saturday, the 19th at 2 p.m. at the Wesleyan Holiness Church in West Bay. May his soul rest in peace. May we all stand in a minute silence. Thank you. You may be seated.
The Lord giveth, and the Lord taketh. Blessed be the name of the Lord.
May his soul rest in peace. Honorable members, I have to tender apologies on behalf of Minister Hugh, who cannot be here due, I think, to a broken heel or something on his foot, but nevertheless, he's not able to be here. We are glad that our colleague, the Honorable Minister of Finance, has made it in person through that ordeal of being stuck at home for 2 weeks. Good to see you, sir. Also, I must announce that the Honorable Minister of Education and the Honorable Deputy Premier are both in their constituencies in Cayman Brac with His Excellency the Governor. Couldn't be here this morning.
Presentation of petitions.
None.
Presentation of papers and of reports.
None.
Questions to honorable ministers and members of the cabinet.
None.
Statements by honorable ministers and members of the cabinet.
The Honorable the Minister of the Honorable the Leader of the Opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I tried catching your eye when the question to ministers.
Sorry, I didn't.
Okay,
Sure.
that's fine.
Go ahead.
And that's what I would like to ask the government. What is happening with the questions? Because it is anticipated that we will be out of here. Pardon me? Really? You have answered that? I don't recall asking at least one, so I don't know how they could be answered unless they answered them in writing, but I haven't received that.
The Honorable Deputy Governor.
Yeah, Mr. Speaker, I have a question for the Leader of the Opposition, and the answer will be sent down today.
One question remains, will be sent to the Assembly today. The
I asked questions.
Leader of the Opposition.
I didn't ask any question on election. I asked questions on the registration of electors.
Oh, yeah. I think that's what the Deputy Governor is saying.
Oh, okay.
And that's coming down to the House today. If we are fortunate to get out of here tonight, then okay. I was just going to say we might have been lucky. Amendments, yes, we have quite a number of laws left on the agenda, as you can see, and a number of committee stages, which takes an awful long time to get through. Next item. The next item is the Honorable the Minister of Financial Services.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the Cayman Islands is a leading center for financial services and has a robust internationally recognized regime and regulatory frameworks. Cayman has continued to be the jurisdiction of choice for global investment funds and other financial services business. The Cayman Islands presents an increasingly attractive jurisdiction in which to reside or to establish a business. Notwithstanding the global headwinds, increased regulation, dealing with the global pandemic and other issues that the Cayman Islands has faced, the financial services industry is the strongest and most robust pillar of our economy. Mr. Speaker, Cayman's legal framework, stable and competent government, relatively high standard of living and low crime rate, experienced judiciary, and respect for the rule of law, good infrastructure, and high caliber financial services professionals in both the public and private sectors means that the Cayman Islands is seeing increased interest from international business to reside and do business here. Recent inflows include reinsurers, private equity houses, and family offices. High net worth persons and ultra high net worth persons need a secure and stable jurisdiction in which to domicile entities and establish other connections. Mr. Speaker, turbulence in other jurisdictions means that Cayman can continue to be a net beneficiary of these inflows. Mr. Speaker, in terms of legal and regulatory frameworks, the government has put in place a number of measures designed to enhance our regimes and codify a risk-based approach. Regulation is not always welcome, Mr. Speaker, but our financial services industry and their stakeholders will ultimately benefit from the jurisdiction's ability to participate on a level playing field with international financial centers and to meet or exceed international standards. Mr. Speaker, the continued inflow of registrations, the establishment of new funds and trusts, interest reported from the professional services firms regarding an uptick in the insurance business, and the establishment of single and multifamily offices are testaments to the success of Cayman's regime. For Caymanians and other residents, this means stability. Stability in government finances and in the provision of government services, such as education, healthcare, social services, and the like. Stability in relation to our international reputation and attractiveness as well. Despite the fact that there will likely continue to be negative reports and or comments published by activist organizations promoting their own agendas, those who do business with and invest in the Cayman Islands know us. They respect us for our robust yet pragmatic regulatory regimes. Mr. Speaker, my ministry's goal, therefore, is to assist the country to remain stable by creating strong regulatory and commercially responsive legislative enhancements for financial services. And despite the rapid pace of global regulatory developments and unforeseen challenges such as the pandemic, we have achieved this goal. Moreover, the Cayman Islands financial services industry has thrived and has supported our overall economy, more so now than ever, given the significant toll that the pandemic has taken on the other pillars of our economy, namely tourism, including that of sports and health tourism. Mr. Speaker, according to the Economics and Statistics Office, the financial and insurance services industry has consistently been the greatest contributor to the Cayman Islands' gross domestic product, or GDP. Taking into consideration the contributions of the professional, scientific, and technical activities, which comprises primarily of legal and accounting services, financial services broadly have contributed to roughly 44.5% of GDP in 2017, 43.8% in 2018, and 43.2% in 2019. Mr. Speaker, despite the slight decline in financial services as a percentage of GDP, which actually stems from the fact that the industry is growing slower than growth of the overall economy, the financial and insurance services industry has maintained its dominance as the largest single contributor to the real GDP of the Cayman Islands. In fact, Mr. Speaker, 2019 posted another year of expansion, with the financial services industry growing by 2.6% in 2019. The industry continues to show consistent growth with 5-year annual average growth rate of 2.2%. Mr. Speaker, in addition to being the major contributor to our economy and source of government revenues, financial services is also consistently one of the largest employers among the Cayman Islands workforce, employing over 3,500 persons, or 7.4% of the workforce in 2019. That represents a 4% increase over 2017. Financial services and insurance activities was the 5th largest employer by sector, according to the Economics and Statistics Office's Labor Force Survey Report, Fall 2019, whereas professional, scientific, and technical activities, again, which primarily includes legal and accounting services, was the 3rd largest employer at 9.9% of the total employed workforce, as reflected in that same report. So again, Mr. Speaker, taken together, financial services broadly employ approximately 8,200 people, or over 17% of the total employed workforce. Mr. Speaker, notably and remarkably, the Cayman Islands has achieved this growth while responding robustly to international assessments and developments. Mr. Speaker, I am delighted to note that the most recent recognition of the Cayman Islands' commitment to adhere to and implement international standards for tax transparency comes from the OECD's Global Forum peer review of our domestic and international frameworks for the automatic exchange of financial account information, or the AEOI, as it's commonly known as. Cayman's framework was found to be, quote, in place, end quote, with no recommendations made to revise our framework at this time. Mr. Speaker, this latest endorsement by the OECD of our framework was published just last week. This is the first stage of the Global Forum's peer review of the Common Reporting Standard. Following this positive assessment of our legal framework, the Global Forum's peer review is now assessing the legal framework in action. In other words, it is looking at the effectiveness of the regime. Mr. Speaker, this peer review is groundbreaking work by the Global Forum in carrying out rigorous, detailed assessments of the legal frameworks for automatic exchange, and I'm very happy to report that this positive endorsement of Cayman's regime by the OECD thus far in the process. As members of Parliament and the public are aware that on the 6th of October, the EU removed the Cayman Islands from its list of non-cooperative jurisdictions for tax purposes. Our appearance on the list was as brief as it could have been, given the EU's processes. For context, though, Mr. Speaker, it's also important to note that since December 2017, when the list was first published and subsequently updated a number of times thereafter, over 30 countries have, at some point, been added to and removed from this particular EU list. Cayman's removal was welcomed by industry and clients of the jurisdiction, who, in a demonstration of confidence in Cayman's stability and in our commitment to meeting regulatory standards, continued to do business with the Cayman Islands during those months in which Cayman was listed, and despite the pandemic. This again, Mr. Speaker, is a testament to the strength and resilience of the country and its stewardship. In addition, Mr. Speaker, my ministry has actively supported the Attorney General in responding to the Financial Action Task Force, or FATF, and the regional FATF-style body, the Caribbean Financial Action Task Force, CFATF. The FATF sets the global standard for AML, which I'll use to refer to anti-money laundering, countering the financing of terrorism, and counter-proliferation financing. Based on this standard, the CFATF assessed the Cayman Islands AML regime and in March 2019 issued its Mutual Evaluation Report, or MER, in which recommendations for enhancing our regime were made. Mr. Speaker, the ministry has made great strides in addressing its area of responsibility covered in the MER by introducing new and amended legislation for the financial services industry to strengthen Cayman's AML regime. In summary, Mr. Speaker, as it relates to responding to various international regulatory assessments of the jurisdiction's financial services industry, the government has achieved success on several notable and vitally important issues over the past 3.5 years. For example, since taking office in 2017, through the work of my ministry, the government has developed a comprehensive economic substance regulatory and reporting regime in compliance with global OECD standards, created a brand new legal and regulatory framework for private funds, enhanced the regulatory regime governing mutual funds, created and introduced a brand new regulatory framework governing virtual asset service providers operating in or from within the jurisdiction, and enhanced our beneficial ownership regime. And these are just a few of the examples of what has been accomplished during this term. Of these significant regulatory initiatives, or I should say, Mr. Speaker, each of these significant regulatory initiatives contributes to Cayman's adaptation and compliance with global regulatory requirements, and as a result, enhances Cayman's attractiveness for investors and those seeking to conduct legitimate business in or from within the jurisdiction. Mr. Speaker, the last few years have been intense for the ministry, the Cayman Islands Monetary Authority, and the financial services industry alike, having to develop, adapt, and adjust to a tremendous volume of legislation. Since 2017, my ministry has produced 124 pieces of primary and secondary legislation. Thus far, for the year 2020 alone, 54 pieces of legislation have been produced by the ministry, which represent over a 150% increase in legislation produced as compared to the last government administration, and 50% increase over 2019 alone. Mr. Speaker, this has been an extremely active and productive government administration. In the interest of time, I will briefly touch on just a few notable pieces of legislation that have been passed and enacted this year alone. Mr. Speaker, as I mentioned earlier, the government has implemented increased transparency and oversight of investment funds through the enactment of the Private Funds Law and amendments of the Mutual Funds Law. CIMA now regulates more than 12,000 private funds and more than 11,000 mutual funds. Similar to our funds regime, the Cayman Islands is now in a stronger position to regulate and attract persons and entities that deal with virtual assets, with the phased commencement of legislation for virtual asset service providers, or VASPs. The VASPs legislation, which incorporates FATF standards for AML, allows for the supervision of persons and entities who are involved in providing business services that use or rely on virtual assets on behalf of another person or entity. Mr. Speaker, this framework better positions the Cayman Islands to welcome the new digital age that is rapidly developing around us. It is designed to bring new business and clients to our shores in an area that, according to global data, is growing significantly. Mr. Speaker, industry is optimistic about the prospects for Cayman that this new framework promotes. In addition to the funds and VASP legislation, I am pleased to report that over the last few years, the ministry worked to strengthen and enhance the Cayman Islands Centralized Beneficial Ownership Register, which was first enacted in 1st of July 2017. Legislative amendments have increased penalties for non-compliance by the companies, which may lead them to being struck off of the company's register. Corporate service providers now have increased powers to pursue non-compliant clients and to report to the BO competent authority about the steps they've taken. Mr. Speaker, successfully orchestrating the high volume of legislative actions taken over the past 3.5 years has been a significant achievement. In doing so, the ministry consulted extensively with industry during the various legislative development processes carried out, sometimes with multiple rounds of consultation on individual pieces of legislation. I am cognizant that consultations take a significant amount of time and effort on everyone's part, but they are absolutely worthwhile to ensure that appropriate decisions are taken. Supported by the ministry team, engagement with local stakeholders has, by necessity, increased sharply over the last few years, not just in terms of the traditional methods of consultation, Mr. Speaker, but also through the use of working groups and the introduction of ministry quarterly update meetings, which was started during this administration. This work is necessary in order to build awareness and understanding of the ministry's work program. As I said, Mr. Speaker, dealing with this high volume of legislative actions taken over the past 3.5 years has certainly been an accomplishment. And in order to support the work that was required of the ministry, a significant investment by the government in the form of budgetary and human resources has been necessary. Mr. Speaker, since the very beginning of my tenure as Minister of Financial Services, I have successfully advocated for, and the government has willingly supported, and this Honourable House has thankfully approved, a substantially increased budget for the ministry, its departments, and CIMA. This government's investment in financial services, related departments, and CIMA has increased by 84% since 2017, from $23.85 million to $43.87 million. The budget for the Cayman Islands Monetary Authority alone has grown by 112% from $13.8 million to $29.3 million. Mr. Speaker, this investment has been critical because without it, Cayman would not have a chance of meeting our international regulatory obligations, which in turn help to build and maintain a robust, commercially competitive financial services industry. The human resources capacity that this government has built provides a strong foundation and enhances the country's ability to adapt to regulatory developments and maximize commercial opportunities. And Mr. Speaker, no doubt increased investment to support the capacity and work of my ministry, its departments, and SEMA will need to happen in the coming years as well. Mr. Speaker, I will now provide a brief overview of the enhancements of each of the financial services related departments within my ministry and SEMA, which have taken place during this administration. The Department of International Tax Cooperation has seen an increase of 110% in its 2021 budget as compared to its 2017 budget. This increase has in large part funded IT systems and human resources that are vital to Cayman meeting its agreements to participate in global tax exchange information exchange, including through the OECD's CRS, or Common Reporting Standard, and the US's FATCA, or Foreign Accounts Tax Compliance Act. Still relating to global tax cooperation, the increased budget also supports Cayman's ability to monitor industry's compliance with our economic substance regulatory framework. Economic substance was first enacted in 2019, and it is intended to ensure that for taxation purposes, companies actually do conduct business in the countries in which they're established. Because of these important regulatory oversight responsibilities, the government has supported the development and expansion of the DITC. Staffing levels are projected to grow by 250% in 4 years, with the headcount for 2017 being 8 and projected to reach 28 employees by next year. Mr. Speaker, CRS, FATCA, and economic substance all went live in different years, which meant that the IT systems to support them were built on an as-needed basis. As noted previously, DITC's budget increase will be used in part to streamline its systems. And I am pleased to say, and industry has also been pleased to hear, that the new DITC's portal is much more than an upgrade. It now covers all 3 compliance standards, that being CRS, FATCA, and economic substance reporting. In addition to improving the reporting processes for industry, the new portal better equips DITC to monitor compliance with our regulatory standards in order to help the Cayman Islands meet our international obligations. Mr. Speaker, over the last few years, the Cayman Islands government, with the support of this House, has significantly adapted our legislative and regulatory frameworks to meet evolving standards from various international and regional bodies, such as the OECD, FATF, and the CFATF, and the European Union. Given the demanded workload to be carried out, the Department of Financial Services Policy and Legislation, or DFSPL, had a compelling need to expand its team to be able to address the various policy and legislative matters at hand. You see, Mr. Speaker, the DFSPL had a small team of only 5 employees, including managers, when I took office as minister in 2017. I am grateful for the support of the government and indeed this Parliament in agreeing to the significantly increased budgetary allocation to the ministry for 2018 to 2021 budgets collectively in order to help address the crucial need for additional personnel to carry out the vitally important functions of the ministry on behalf of the government. Between 2017 and 2021, via the approved budget and supplemental funding to support its mandate, the DFSPL is projected to have an 89% increase in its budget. This is primarily attributable to an increase in headcount to 10 policy staff and 13 staff overall, which represents a 160% increase in human resources for the department since 2017, and a larger budget to support the funding of important services such as legal, communications, and public affairs support. Over the past 3.5 years, the workload of the ministry, and in particular that of the DFSPL, has been enormous. There is no other way to put it, Mr. Speaker. As mentioned earlier, since taking office in June 2017, the DFSPL has produced 124 pieces of primary and secondary legislation. In reviewing the outputs of the department thus far, as I said, for 2020, 54 pieces of legislation have been produced, which represent over 150% increase in legislation produced as compared to the last government administration, and 50% increase over 2019 alone, all while dealing with the impacts of the global pandemic, no less. Mr. Speaker, having persons who are familiar with and understand the legislative drafting process is integral to the work of the DFSPL. I was amazed to find that for a ministry that produces the sheer volume of legislation that it does, there was no dedicated in-house expertise to assist in providing guidance and oversight, helping to pull together and rationalize the legislative development process and functions required of the ministry. To that end, Mr. Speaker, I'm very pleased to report that the government has supported the creation and the funding of a senior legislative advisor position for the ministry, which has recently been filled by a very able and experienced person who has worked closely with the ministry throughout the past several years. Having this talent as a part of the ministry certainly helps to increase its capacity and support to the minister going forward. Mr. Speaker, the ministry and the government is, of course, deeply appreciative of the support given by the Attorney General's chambers in actually drafting the various pieces of legislation as required. The Cayman Islands General Registry has seen a consistent budget trend over the 4-year period. From 2017 to 2021, General Registry will see a 9% increase in the budget, and the headcount is expected to increase from 43 to a projected 62 people in 2021, which represents a 44% increase in personnel since 2017. To continue delivering a high level of performance across the various services with a constant budget, the registry has become more efficient with its resources. The introduction of the Cayman Business Portal and Corporate Administration Platform has allowed the General Registry to deliver services to corporate service providers on island in a cost-effective manner. And the General Registry, as the competent authority for beneficial ownership, has the legal authority to monitor businesses' compliance with providing beneficial ownership information to government as required by law. Mr. Speaker, the jurisdiction's primary financial services regulator, the Cayman Islands Monetary Authority, has been allocated a 112% increase in budget, which translates to almost $15.4 million over the past 4 years since taking office in 2017 and factoring in the 2021 budget. In addition to the budgeted increase, CIMA has consistently received supplemental funding to at key intervals over the past several years to support its growth, and with the support of this Honourable House, has received nearly $16 million in total supplemental funding between 2017 and 2020 to address various changes to the legislative and regulatory frameworks in response to evolving international standards. Mr. Speaker, the most recent supplemental funding received by CIMA for over $6 million supported the creation and/or enhancements to the two very critical regulatory regimes, that being the registration and supervision of private funds and broadened mutual fund scope, and the regulation of virtual asset service providers, Again, I thank all members of Parliament for your support in approving this additional funding to CEMA in order to ensure that CEMA has the resources necessary to implement these regulatory regimes. Mr. Speaker, as outlined in detail, this government has committed to actively support our domestic economy and the local financial services industry through legislative enhancements. But, Mr. Speaker, this government has also made available significant financial contributions to support the financial services industry's engagement and other activities. The support made available to Cayman Finance alone has increased by 253% since taking office in 2017. Cayman Islands' $750,000 per annum was allocated to support the activities of Cayman Finance in the Ministries' 2018 and 2019 budget, and again in the 2020-2021 budget. Mr. Speaker, I am pleased to report that earlier this year, the government tabled a revised purchase agreement with Cayman Finance, covering the revision of Cayman Finance's 2020-2021 business plan. I am happy to see that this business plan is now in place. By necessity, it is flexible enough to cover global developments in financial services in real time. At a local level, Cayman Finance has designed activities to raise public awareness and understanding of our financial services industry and to create summer internship opportunities for young Caymanians. Its international activities cover engagement with international industry stakeholders and research and marketing activities that proactively seek to protect the reputation of Cayman's primary industry. In addition, Mr. Speaker, the Cayman Finance Purchase Agreement stipulates quarterly progress reports on the delivery of the activities and their cost. This creates an accountability framework to evaluate the delivery of value for money. Mr. Speaker, over the last few years, the government has made a substantial investment in public affairs and communications within the budgets of various ministries to develop a strong and positive presence in key foreign markets for the jurisdiction. In terms of face-to-face international engagement efforts made, I have led several delegations to Washington, D.C. over the years to meet with influential policymakers on Capitol Hill, as well as doing likewise with EU permanent representatives in Brussels. In addition to the significantly enhanced budget allocation to support Cayman Finance's research, communication, and engagement efforts, as I discussed earlier, with the 2020 budget year drawing to an end and 2021 on the horizon, the ministry will be engaging in a number of new initiatives to enhance its public affairs and communication support to strengthen its ongoing efforts in key markets such as the UK, US, EU, and Republic of China. Mr. Speaker, this will complement the engagement plans of the Cayman Islands Government Office in the UK, which is led by the Cayman Islands representative and supported by my ministry's recently hired financial services attaché, who will be based in the UK and will also cover the EU region. Mr. Speaker, work with the Ministry of International Trade will also continue in this regard. From the very beginning, in June 2017, when speaking with both internal, that being ministry, and external stakeholders, being local financial services industry representatives, I have communicated the need for all stakeholders, government and industry alike, to engage more proactively in addressing the perception problem about Cayman that unfortunately still exists among some influential quarters. Mr. Speaker, in keeping with the policy priorities in this area, which were discussed during my 2020-2021 budget debate last year, one of the key aspects of our public relations efforts has been to challenge the stereotypes that abound regarding the Cayman Islands as perpetuated by the entertainment industry. These stereotypes exist mainly because of misinformation and ignorance about the Cayman Islands and that of our financial services industry. And as such, throwaway references can be seen in television, films, and advertisements without any real thought as to their validity. It is therefore up to us as a jurisdiction to challenge the stereotypes and help to educate the entertainment industry as to what the Cayman Islands is really about. Such careless, throwaway comments can harm the reputation of our islands because collectively they reinforce the myth that the country operates on a shady level. And when that myth is repeated consistently, it morphs into a generally accepted belief. Therefore, Mr. Speaker, it is unacceptable for us to sit back and do nothing. As a country, we must take on each challenge as it arises. One such challenge happened earlier this year, Mr. Speaker, when the government issued a cease and desist letter to AT&T requesting that it change one of its television advertisements that depicted the Cayman Islands in a negative light. We also used that opportunity to inform the company that the Cayman Islands financial services are provided in accordance with global financial standards and that the OECD ranking placed the Cayman Islands on par with other countries such as Canada and England for transparency and tax information sharing. We stated that any insinuation to the contrary was wrong and inaccurate. We also advised them that the government reserved its right to legal and appropriate regulatory actions should they not comply. Mr. Speaker, I am happy to report that AT&T did in fact agree to change and remove the reference to the Cayman Islands in their popular advertisement as a result. Mr. Speaker, there have been other challenges made by the government during the past year, which have included challenging a reference to being called a tax haven in a tax textbook. As a result of our challenge, the publishing company subsequently agreed to remove the reference in all future editions of the publication. The government has also challenged several instances where Cayman was spuriously referenced in episodes of a few sitcoms aired on popular streaming platforms. Mr. Speaker, to challenge every throwaway negative comment about the Cayman Islands is a formidable task, but this government believes it is vital to do so in order to help minimize such references in the future and to educate the broader public about how the Cayman Islands operates as a legitimate and integral cog in the wheel of the global economy. Mr. Speaker, it gives me great pleasure to report to this Honourable House, a year after I initially indicated that moving forward, the government would, quote, take on Hollywood as a euphemism for mass media generally as necessary. We have done just that. And we have already seen positive, tangible results as a result of doing so. And I dare add, Mr. Speaker, that we did so without anybody setting foot, least of all me, in Hollywood. So despite the lack of apparent understanding of some people as to why the government would attempt to be more proactive in this way, as can be seen from the notable successes that I have just highlighted, there is great vision in taking a more proactive approach to challenging ill-informed stereotypes. Mr. Speaker, I am not saying that as a country we will be successful in addressing or even possibly identifying, for that matter, each and every spurious reference to the Cayman Islands. But what I am saying, as I have done from the beginning, is that we must take both a defensive as well as proactive stance to defending and promoting the significant strides made by and the reality of the Cayman Islands. We cannot sit back and let Hollywood or any activist lobby organization define who we are or what we do. Mr. Speaker, I'm honored to be the minister and a part of this government that has helped to move the needle forward in this direction to bring about some positive results thus far. So to summarize the position taken, Mr. Speaker, I borrow a quote from the former U.S. Attorney General Robert Kennedy by saying, "There are those that look at things the way they are and ask why. I dream of things that never were and ask why not." Mr. Speaker, I will now provide a brief summary of my ministry's priorities for the weeks, months, and year ahead. As previously discussed, the Ministry is working to strengthen its engagement strategy that employs targeted public relations and communications. In doing so, the Ministry will continue to work in close collaboration with the Cayman Islands Government Office in the UK and with the Ministry of International Trade to help determine how best and effectively to deploy additional resources overseas to promote and defend the jurisdiction accordingly. Mr. Speaker, from all accounts, the year 2021 is shaping up to be another intense year with respect to scrutiny of Cayman's legislative and regulatory regimes as part of the work programs of various international and regional organizations. From ongoing FATF, OECD, and EU reviews of Cayman's AML and tax regimes, the Ministry will continue to have a significant workload ahead. In keeping with the government's practice, industry will be consulted as part of these ongoing initiatives, and the Ministry will be issuing a more fulsome industry advisory outlining more details in the coming week. In addition, with increased international focus on the need to attract sustainable investments to recover from the current economic recession that many countries are facing as a result of the pandemic, there is an opportunity for the Cayman Islands to begin to more prominently highlight the positives that the country can bring in this arena as an experienced, stable, and trustworthy facilitator of international investments that can positively contribute to the EU's and others' sustainability and economic agenda. Mr. Speaker, the Ministry's continued engagement on these subjects, both locally and internationally, will inform and help shape Cayman's response and action to be taken. Mr. Speaker, 2020 has been a challenging year worldwide, with unprecedented pressures placed upon societies all across the globe, the Cayman Islands being no exception. The fact that the government is able to provide the level of support that we do to our people and businesses most impacted financially by this pandemic is made possible largely because of the enduring strength and resilience of our financial services industry. And that strength and resilience is predicated on an effective working relationship that has been built between the government, through the work of the Ministry, CIMA, and local industry professionals. Cayman's international rankings are a testament to this work and the robustness of our industry and economy as a whole, with Moody's reaffirming Cayman's AA3 stable rating as of the 13th of April 2020, and the OECD's Forum on Harmful Tax Practices Global Standard on Economic Substance assessing the Cayman Islands as being, quote, not harmful in June 2019, the highest ranking possible. In addition, the OECD Global Forum on Transparency and Exchange of Information for Tax Purposes marked Cayman as, quote, largely compliant in 2017, the same ranking given to countries like Germany, UK, and Canada, and has most recently assessed Cayman's legal frameworks for the automatic exchange of financial account information to be, quote, in place, with no recommendations made to revise our frameworks at this time. Mr. Speaker, these are accomplishments worth noting and repeating frequently, as the good news about the Cayman Islands is often lost in the rhetoric and utterances of those intent on painting Cayman in a bad light. It is also important to remind the public of these accomplishments which were achieved during this government administration to help combat the, shall we say, selective memory syndrome that often occurs, especially around this time in the term. Mr. Speaker, the continued growth of the financial services industry year over year in real economic terms is a testament to the continued success of the Cayman Islands as a global financial center. This success, which has been consistent throughout this period of intense change over the last several years, is in turn a testament to the leadership of this government and those at the helm of financial services, helping the country navigate the turbulent waters. Therefore, as a result of many hours of complex, diligent, and vitally important work carried out by all involved, financial services in the Cayman Islands continues to grow. As a government working in tandem with stakeholders, including industry as appropriate, we are committed and prepared to proactively and reactively respond to global developments to ensure the continued success of the Cayman Islands for years to come. Mr. Speaker, the challenges are great, and yes, the setbacks may come, but we have proven that we are up to the task to face them head on and to overcome. The hallmark of great leadership is not how you perform during times of relative calm and prosperity, but instead how you stand up and perform during the times of great challenge, uncertainty, and pressure. This government has weathered and continues to weather the storms of the past several years. The financial services, legislative, and regulatory landscape has changed tremendously over the past decade, and the required pace of change has never been as intense as it has been over the last 3 years. However, given the global impact of COVID-19, geopolitical priorities, concerns, and rhetoric have also intensified, and so too have the international regulatory initiatives which reflect such priorities. Mr. Speaker, year 2020 has been a year like none other. From intense earthquakes to raging landfill fires, from a worldwide pandemic to powerful regional tropical storms and hurricanes, the Cayman Islands has successfully weathered them all. Whereas the year 2021 is shaping up to be another intense year, my ministry, its respective departments, and SEMA are all in a better position to effectively carry out the required tasks at hand and those to come. Mr. Speaker, as a result of the investment made by this government administration, the ministry is now better equipped to assist the government and country to respond to the ever-evolving global regulatory landscape and to the various international assessments of the jurisdiction in order to maintain Cayman's crucial role and position as a global financial center. These significant enhancements were brought about during this term as a result of visionary and tenacious leadership, and with support of the government and Parliament alike. I thank you all.
Personal explanations.
None.
Obituary and other ceremonial speeches.
None.
Raising a matter of privileges.
None.
Government business. Bills. Second readings. Private funding of legal services bill 2020.
The Honorable the Attorney General.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I beg to move second reading of a bill entitled The Private Funding of Legal Services Bill 2020.
The bill has been duly moved. Is the Attorney General speaking?
Yes, Mr. Speaker, thank you. Thank you. Mr. Speaker, the long title is a bill for law to provide for the regulation of private funding of legal services and for incidental and connected purposes. Sir, the purpose of this proposed legislation is to provide, Mr. Speaker, a statutory framework for alternative ways of funding the provision of legal services in the Cayman Islands through the utilization of contingency fee agreements and litigation funding agreements, Mr. Speaker. And Mr. Speaker, this is consistent with the government's quest to ensure access to justice for persons who would otherwise be disadvantaged, Mr. Speaker, because of impecuniosity. Mr. Speaker, if I may provide some background to this legislation. In February 2012, I made a request of the Law Reform Commission to undertake a review of the law relating to conditional and contingency fee agreements with a view, Mr. Speaker, to having some reform in that area. This referral, Mr. Speaker, was triggered by the fact that there was a case before the Court of Appeal in Latoya Barrett versus the Attorney General, in which the Court of Appeal suggested, Mr. Speaker, that an examination of the legal effect of conditional fee agreements and the law of maintenance and champerty be undertaken. Mr. Speaker, I'll explain those terms later on. Mr. Speaker, for the benefit of members, a conditional fee agreement, in short, is an agreement in which an attorney at law accepts the client's normal fee with an agreed uplift amount in the event of success, so as to compensate the attorney at law for the risk of not being paid in the event of a failure. Contingency, Mr. Speaker, is an agreement in which the attorney at law retains an agreed percentage of the client's recovery and is paid nothing in the event of the action being unsuccessful. So, Mr. Speaker, no win, no fee. No win, no pay, in short. Mr. Speaker, the Court of Appeal noted that when discussing the applicability of the conditional fee agreements, complex issues of public policy were involved, and that therefore a full account must be taken of all the relevant interests, and most importantly, Mr. Speaker, the need to provide access to justice for those who otherwise would not be able to afford it. And Mr. Speaker, though an examination of the law in this area had been requested, it should be noted that the conditional fee agreements have been used informally in the Cayman Islands for some time before then. But the validity, Mr. Speaker, has been acknowledged by the courts in a number of cases, to the extent that the court has provided practice directions which attorneys at law would be required to follow in putting together these conditional agreements. Mr. Speaker, this practice is accepted notwithstanding the fact that the common law offenses of maintenance and champerty have never been repealed and therefore still form part of the common law of the Cayman Islands. Mr. Speaker, champity and maintenance usually goes together to describe instances whereby a person, usually a stranger, and sometimes an attorney, actively encourages someone to pursue a lawsuit in court. Mr. Speaker, something that usually a stranger has no interest in. But in some instances, not only is the person encouraged verbally to pursue these lawsuits, but agrees, Mr. Speaker, the person encouraging them agrees to fund it on condition that if the case is successful, then the stranger/attorney will get a share of any of the money awarded or the property recovered as a result of the case. So it's basically inciting, encouraging, and in some instances agreeing to fund. Case go ahead, even though they have no other interest in the merits of the case itself. So, Mr. Speaker, as I said, champity is an aggravated form of maintenance whereby the parties kind of struck up an agreement to split the proceeds. These arrangements, Mr. Speaker, are or were frowned upon because it's said to be contrary to public policy because they were seen as encouraging frivolous litigation, indeed unnecessary lawsuits. So, accordingly, Mr. Speaker, the concept of buying into someone else's lawsuit or someone's case was strictly forbidden and was made a crime at common law and was also called a civil wrong or a tort. Mr. Speaker, it is still a common law offense and a tort in the Cayman Islands. But, Mr. Speaker, like most things, with the passage of time, things and thinking have evolved and continue to do so. Therefore, Mr. Speaker, a number of developed countries, including the UK, Canada, Australia, and others, have abolished these crimes and the tort, champity, and maintenance. The UK did so, Mr. Speaker, via the 1967 Criminal Law Act, and Canada did so back in 1953, I think. Mr. Speaker, although Cayman hasn't formally abolished these things, as I said, it was accepted that times have changed and there is a need to provide greater flexibility in allowing people, litigants, with genuine claims to be able to access justice to litigate those claims. Therefore, Mr. Speaker, our Chief Justice took the view that with proper safeguards in place, the balance of public policy should weigh in permitting some form of such agreement for the otherwise would-be disadvantaged litigants. Accordingly, Mr. Speaker, in 2002, the learned Chief Justice had this to say, Mr. Speaker, and I go to quote from what he said, but which was reported in the Court of Appeal judgment of Latoya Barrett in 2012. Mr. Speaker, today I'll provide you with a copy of the Mr. Speaker, if you turn to paragraph 12 of the judgment, I think I flagged it there for you. Just to add some context, the Chief Justice went on to consider whether agreements with a success fee were unlawful as being champertus maintenance and void on grounds of public policy. He rejected the argument that the court should regard any attenuation of the common law position as being a matter for the legislature. In his view, this overlooked the mutable nature of the common law itself as it changes to meet the needs of society. It also overlooked the particular duties and responsibilities of the court in Cayman. The Chief Justice put the issue of public policy at paragraphs 36 and 37 of his judgment in this way, and I quote, "If a lawyer anywhere has too much at stake in the success of litigation, he may be tempted to conduct that litigation in a manner which is unethical. The ultimate concern is that the administration of justice could be impaired by improper conduct of litigation, motivated by the self-interest of lawyers being commonplace. It follows that a situation should not be encouraged in which lawyers would be exposed to temptations which might lead them to behave other than in accordance with their best traditions. Improbable though such a scenario might seem in an environment where professional honor remains the norm, those who fear have only to look to the experience in other places where contingency fees are routinely allowed to find cause. There is, however, another equally important and competing public interest, that of ensuring that everyone has access to justice. For many, such as the plaintiffs, in this case, that access would be denied for want of legal representation were it not for the willingness of some lawyers to undertake litigation on the risky basis of conditional fee agreement. End of quote, Mr. Speaker. He said that in 2002, but is reported in the Court of Appeal repeated it in 2012. Mr. Speaker, Mr. Speaker, the existence of these common law offenses within the laws of the islands raises a number of issues, mainly, as you heard, because of the potential ramifications involved for both the attorneys and the client who may choose to fund legal services through alternative ways. Mr. Speaker, following on from the referral to the Law Reform Commission, the Commission produced and made available for public consultation an issues paper entitled, and I quote, "A Review of Litigation Funding in Cayman Islands, Conditional and Contingency Fee Agreements," dated 29 December 2015. And they also provided a Supporting Private Funding of Legal Services Bill 2015 and the Private Funding of Legal Services Regulations, Draft Regulations 2015. Mr. Speaker, the consultation process of the Commission was informed by comments received from the judiciary, the legal associations, as well as the public. The process, Mr. Speaker, culminated in the submission of a final report on litigation funding and the Supporting Private Funding of Legal Services Bill 2020 and the Draft Private Funding of Legal Services Regulations 2020. Mr. Speaker, the final report of the Commission detailed a comprehensive examination of the law, as well as the history, the advantages, disadvantages, and the social impact of similar types of agreements in jurisdictions such as the UK, Australia, Canada, and the USA. The Commission, Mr. Speaker, confirmed that conditional and contingency fee agreements have been viewed by proponents as essential routes for persons of limited financial means to access justice, especially in cases relating to injury, personal injury, and medical malpractice cases. However, Mr. Speaker, notwithstanding the prevalence of and the advantages offered by such agreements, the Commission pointed out that they do present an incentive to excessive litigation and may promote a compensation culture. And that is part of the public policy concerns that I spoke about earlier, Mr. Speaker, whether they could promote frivolous lawsuits or excessive litigation for want of wrong reasons. Mr. Speaker, the Private Funding of Legal Services Bill 2020, which is now before this Parliament, seeks therefore to balance those competing benefits and address the concerns. Generally, Mr. Speaker, the Private Funding of Legal Services Bill provides for contingency fee agreements, which comprise the US-style approach, that is no-win, no-fee agreements, as well as a conditional fee-style agreement with the success fee uplift. Mr. Speaker, the success fee uplift, you take on the risk, not getting paid if you lose the case. However, if you win, you can get a fee agreement of 33 1/3% over and above what your normal fee would be. That is part of the compensation for the risk of you taking on the case and possibly not getting paid, because if the case is unsuccessful, you're not being paid. And so, it can't exceed 200%. It can't exceed 100%, but usually it's about 33 1/3%. And so, above. Well, Mr. Speaker, just to make sure the agreement itself is supervised by the court. It has to be approved by the court. Has to be put in writing, has to be agreed by the court, signed off, and so on. So there's safeguards there. So. Yeah. Clerk of the courts. Mr. Speaker, Mr. Speaker, the bill also provides, Mr. Speaker, the ability to support third-party litigation funding agreements. A litigation funding agreement, Mr. Speaker, is an agreement under which third parties can fund litigation in return for a share of the proceeds. Mr. Speaker, the government considers this legislation to be timely, as I said, in light of the recent reforms to the, well, not so recent, but reforms to the legal aid system, as more and more government resources are being called for in order to ensure that persons are guaranteed proper access to justice. Mr. Speaker, it also comes on the heel, if you recall, of the government recently enacting the protective cost order law, which also provides persons with the comfort, if you will, of being able to challenge certain decisions without having to be looking over their shoulder, of being saddled with prohibitive cost orders. Contingency fee, Mr. Speaker, and litigation funding agreements have been considered by many as an effective way of ensuring that the legal aid system is not overburdened, while at the same time ensuring that persons can obtain effective legal representations. And so, given the considerable cost of the high-quality legal representation, Mr. Speaker, the Honourable Leader of the Opposition spoke about that a couple of days ago, members will agree that all too often the most well-financed party wins a case or obtains a favorable settlement. Accordingly, Mr. Speaker, both types of agreements benefit the legal system by leveling, if you will, the playing field for underfunded litigants. The agreements have, Mr. Speaker, the added benefit of incentivizing attorneys to work diligently on their client's case. Mr. Speaker, if I might just touch on the clauses of the bill quickly. As usual, Clause 1 deals with the short title and the commencement provisions. Clause 2, Mr. Speaker, is a definition clause which features several important definitions such as client, funder, legal services, normal fees, proceedings, quasi-criminal proceedings, and success fee. Mr. Speaker, legal services is defined as meaning any advice or representation provided by an attorney to a client in proceedings and in anticipation of or in contemplation of legal proceedings. Mr. Speaker, this definition was inserted to ensure that legislation makes it clear that the funding under the law was available not only for persons who are conducting legal proceedings, but also for persons who are contemplating bringing proceedings and where deliberations or meetings culminate in an agreement prior to the court action. Mr. Speaker, Clause 3 defines contingency fee agreement to encompass both conditional and contingency fee agreements. In particular, Mr. Speaker, the clause states that an attorney at law may enter into a contingency fee agreement with a client in which it is agreed that the remuneration paid to the attorney at law for the legal services provided to or on behalf of the client is contingent in whole or in part on the successful outcome of the matter in respect of which services are provided. Mr. Speaker, the clause also delimits the proceedings to which contingency fee agreements will relate. For example, sir, a contingency fee agreement cannot be entered into in relation to proceedings under the penal code, that is for criminal matters, or any other criminal or quasi-criminal proceedings, traffic matters, and so those are not covered. Quasi-criminal proceedings, Mr. Speaker, is defined in Clause 2 as one dealing with sort of non-criminal offense that carries up Thank you. Thanks. That carries a penalty similar to that of criminal offense, but which is subject to less complex court procedures. And I mentioned traffic offenses, Mr. Speaker, or workplace health and safety offenses. Mr. Speaker, the exclusion of criminal or quasi-criminal proceedings is in keeping with legislation in other jurisdictions such as UK and Canada, and a long-established public policy that third parties should not be able to profit from defending or assisting in the defense of persons charged with crimes, Mr. Speaker. Likewise, Mr. Speaker, Clause 3 prohibits the formation of contingency fee agreements for legal services concerning matrimonial proceedings relating to child care or custody matters and matters with respect to parental contact or access to a child. So, Speaker, that's understandable. Proceeds from those should really go to the benefit of the child. Mr. Speaker, this limitation is based on the notion of having regard to the best interest of the child as a paramount consideration, as well as a long-held view of promoting and preserving marriage, which is best served in the legal system by prohibiting attorneys from making divorce cases and contingencies. Mr. Speaker, Clause 3 does, however, provide an exception for services relating to matrimonial financial disputes which do not involve the care of a child, where an attorney at law gains the approval of the court. The reason for this exception, Mr. Speaker, is that if there are no children concerned in the matter, a spouse wishing a substantial lump sum should not be prevented from entering into a contingency fee agreement with his or her attorney. Clause 4, sir, sets out the conditions which are applicable to contingency fee agreements. In particular, Mr. Speaker, Clause 4 stipulates that the maximum fees which may be charged in contingency fees, sets out the maximum fees which can be charged for contingency fee agreements. For example, the clause states that if a contingency fee agreement is an agreement under which the attorney at law is entitled to a success fee for any legal services rendered, the success fee shall not exceed the normal fees of the attorney at law by more than 100%. However, Mr. Speaker, the attorney at law and the client can apply to the court to seek an exemption from that limit. Mr. Speaker, if you have a lawyer who charges $900 an hour for a particular matter, and he does the case on a contingency basis or conditional basis, he is not allowed to charge more than $1,800. He can goes up to $1,800 an hour. Yeah, it's contingent as an agreement. But usually, Mr. Speaker, usually it is capped at 33 and a third percent. And so, right. But again, it is compensating the lawyer compensating him for the risk of taking on the case without not showing whether he will get paid at the end of the day if he's unsuccessful. Mr. Speaker, the draft regulation in support of the legislation would provide for further guidelines with respect to maximum fees. In contemplation, Mr. Speaker, in the case of claims sounding in money, the total of any success fee payable by the client to the attorney at law shall not exceed. Sorry? Mr. Speaker, on the other hand, where a contingency fee agreement involves a percentage of the amount or of the value of the property recovered in an action or proceedings, the amount to be paid to the attorney at law shall not exceed 33.3% of the amount or of the value of the property recovered in the action or the proceeds. Right. So again, if you're talking about an insurance claim, $1 million, then you should. Yeah. And Mr. Speaker, with regard to the form and content of the contingency fee agreement, this is set out in Clause 5, which provides, among other things, that such an agreement shall be in writing and must be signed by the attorney at law and the client, or by an authorized person on behalf of the client. The contingency fee agreement, Mr. Speaker, must also state certain prescribed matters. Should this legislation be passed, Mr. Speaker, the proposed draft regulation would provide the prescribed matters to ensure that the form and content of the contingency fee agreement could easily change with the evolution of the law. The provision, Mr. Speaker, would entail further contents which contingency fee agreements should contain generally, as well as for litigious matters. They would further prohibit provisions that require the consent of the attorney before a claim may be abandoned, discontinued, or settled at the instructions of the client. In other words, the client should still have the say as to whether they want to pursue the claim, whether it can be abandoned or discontinued, or which prevent the client from terminating the contingency fee agreement with the attorney at law, or if you want to change attorneys. All of those safeguards will be put in place. Mr. Speaker, Clause 6 deals with the awards of cost and provides that a contingency fee agreement does not affect the award of cost as between party and party. So, Mr. Speaker, for example, I sue you and I have a lawyer doing it and contingency. It doesn't prevent you having to pay me my costs. If I'm successful, you're still liable to have to pay the costs. And so the unsuccessful party still have to pay my costs. Mr. Speaker, Clause 7 prohibits an attorney at law who is a party to a contingency fee agreement from claiming more fees than the agreement provides, unless such extra fees are expressly permitted and agreed to. The intent of this, Mr. Speaker, is to ensure that legal fees remain fair and reasonable. Similarly, Mr. Speaker, Clause 8 renders invalid any agreement which seeks to relieve an attorney at law from negligence or from liability for any action for which the attorney at law would otherwise be liable in their capacity. Translation, Mr. Speaker, even though the attorney is working on a contingency fee basis, he cannot negligently handle the matter. He's still on the hook if he acts negligently. This provision, Mr. Speaker, seeks to ensure that the standard of care expected of legal professionals is upheld with dealings between an attorney at law and a client, and an attorney at law bears responsibility for the quality of his or her legal services. Mr. Speaker, under clauses 9 and 10 of the bill, no action may be brought upon any contingency fee agreement, since the agreement should reflect the will of the parties embodied in their contractual agreement. However, Mr. Speaker, an application can be made to the court to determine the validity or the effect of the contingency fee agreement and to set it aside or enforce the contingency fee agreement where necessary. In addition, Mr. Speaker, under Clause 11, the court may order the reopening of the contingency fee agreement upon application by a person who has made all payments under the contingency fee agreement if it appears to the court that there are special circumstances of the case requiring the contingency fee agreement to be reopened. If it is so determined, Mr. Speaker, the court may order the whole or any part of the amount received by the attorney at law to be repaid by the attorney to the client on such terms and conditions as the court deems just. Mr. Speaker, Clause 12 provides the clerk of the court with the supervisory role over contingency fee agreements. The clerk of the court, Mr. Speaker, must examine a contingency fee agreement before payment is made under the agreement, where the client is in a fiduciary position, such as a guardian, an attorney, or a trustee under a deed or a will. Again, Mr. Speaker, to provide some safeguards there. Mr. Speaker, Clause 13 provides that if the client pays the whole or any part of any amount due under the contingency fee agreement without the previous allowance of the clerk of the court or the direction of the court, the client may be directed by the court to account to the person whose estate or property is charged with the amount paid or any part of it for that amount so charged. And the attorney at law who accepts the payment may be ordered by the court, Mr. Speaker, to refund the amount received. Clause 14, Mr. Speaker, prohibits an attorney at law from purchasing all or any part of a client's interest in a case which the attorney at law intends to bring or maintain on behalf of the client. Lawyers? Mr. Speaker, Clause 15 states that except or otherwise permitted by the legislation, a bill of an attorney at law arising on a contingency fee is not liable to taxation by the court. Mr. Speaker, Clause 16 of the bill provides for litigation funding agreements, which as I explained earlier, Mr. Speaker, permits third-party funding of litigation in return for share of the proceeds. The authorization of such agreements seems sensible, Mr. Speaker, as they are well known and are growing in the United Kingdom and elsewhere, and would be a valuable option for potential users and funders alike in this jurisdiction. Mr. Speaker, I'm sure members here would have seen this sort of a growing business now where you have third parties whose business it is to provide like a loan, for example, to someone who would want to bring an action but doesn't have the money. And they would have this litigation funding services where the money is loaned to the litigant. He pursues actions, recovers, and then pays back the loan with whatever other conditions or imposed there. Mr. Speaker, it may be worth noting, though, that there is no perceived need at this time to limit the fees being charged or the measures of compensation payable to litigation funders under such agreements. This so, Mr. Speaker, because given the nature of the litigation funding business, it is not foreseen that potential funders would likely to be interested in funding any cases other than the real high-value commercial cases. In an event, sir, the Grand Court already has the power under Section 24(3) of the Judicature Act to make adverse cost orders against non-parties, including in time third-party litigation funders, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, there will be also, as it relates to this particular area, a code of conduct which will set out, Mr. Speaker, different conditions for the operation of the litigation funding agreement. Mr. Speaker, I mentioned earlier on about champerty and maintenance. Clauses 17 and 18 of the bill would abolish the common law offenses of maintenance and champerty, and would also abolish the tort, Mr. Speaker, using the approach taken in several jurisdictions, and make clear that embezzlement is enforceable. Mr. Speaker, that's a third aspect of it. It's EMBRACERY, and that is an act where someone seeks to corrupt a jury by offering to pay a jury to return a particular verdict in a particular way. That will remain a crime, Mr. Speaker. That's not been abolished at all. So that will remain an offense. However, Mr. Speaker, while the offenses and torts would be abolished under the bill, the abolition of criminal and civil liability for maintenance and champerty will not affect any rule of law as to the cases in which a contract is to be treated as contrary to public policy or otherwise. Finally, Mr. Speaker, Clause 19 provides for the making of regulations relating to litigation funding agreements and contingency fee agreements by the Cabinet after consultation with the Lord Chief Justice and the legal profession. The clause also provides that the Rules Committee of the Grand Court may make rules of court to give effect to the legislation. Mr. Speaker, the government believes that this bill would substantially enhance the justice system for the reasons that I offered earlier on, including the need for greater access to justice, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the Court of Appeal in the Latoya Barrett matter had this to say when disposing of the case at the time in 2012, February 2012. Mr. Speaker, I'll just read, hopefully we'll get the context, but I'll just read a very short aspect of what they had to say. Paragraph 70 of the judgment, it says, the Attorney General's assurance that the matter will be referred to the Law Reform Commission and may thereafter be addressed in legislation is a further reason for taking the view in this court that it would not be appropriate to decide either the question whether the Chief Justice was entitled to take the course that he did in the Quorum case, or the question whether, if so, the conclusion that he reached on the substantive issue, whether or not public policy requires that conditional fee agreements be struck down, should be upheld. It is more sensible, as it seems to me, to leave the position as it now is, until the Law Reform Commission has considered what, in its view, the public interest requires, and the legislature, or perhaps the Rules Committee, have had the opportunity to respond to its recommendations. And Mr. Speaker, in context, what the Court of Appeal had been advocating in the Latoya Barrett matter is that you had 3 cases, Chief Justice, Justice Sanders, and Justice Quinn. All 3 of them seem to be saying something kind of different in 3 different cases, one of them being a BCCI matter. And the Court of Appeal's position was, listen, this is an area that cries out for reform, but rather than the court attempting to do so, it should be left to the legislature. And so the assurance that the Attorney General gave that, well, it started in 2002 and culminated in the Court of Appeal judgment in 2012. And the Law Reform Commission has been looking at it since then. And so, but the point that they were making there, Mr. Speaker, is that rather than we trying to bring some order to this by way of different courts having different opinions, the best thing to do to bring clarity to this was to put it in legislation. Let the legislature deal with the matter, and that will then address the appropriate framework going forward as to how it should be treated. And so, hence, Mr. Speaker, that's how we landed here. And so, Mr. Speaker, I think this is very timely. It is something that should be welcomed. And as I mentioned before, the conjoint effect of the legal aid, protective cost order, and this, it should provide, Mr. Speaker, some relief to those who would seek to pursue justice in the courts, but would otherwise be deterred because it is cost prohibitive, Mr. Speaker. They can't afford it. And so, Mr. Speaker, I commend the private funding bill to honorable members of this Parliament for safe passage. Thank you.
For Georgetown Central.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise to give my contribution to the private funding of the legal services bill. I want to say, firstly, thank you so much to the Legal Reform Commission and the AG for bringing this bill. Like he rightfully said, this is about time that we brought some sort of legal framework to offer the people of this country better access to justice, particularly on suits that have results ending with funding matters. I just want the government to recognize that there could be some adverse effects to this, and hopefully they will monitor and keep a close eye on this. Because rightfully so, Mr. Speaker, like the AG have highlighted, this is somewhat big business in other jurisdictions. And ultimately, we could find that there may be more added pressures on our court systems and our court spacing. As you know, we've already had the ongoing problem with court space in the Cayman Islands. So if there is many more persons trying to take this opportunity of what this law provides, you may find yourself with more access to the courts. Now, nobody can quantify that at this moment, but to keep a close eye on it, because they may create that pressure. That's the only negative that I find with it, but it'd be important doing my job to highlight. Excuse me. Mr. Speaker, I also agree with the Attorney General by saying that inadvertently, I think this is going to force us all to be better behaved under law in fear of being sued due to the ease that this bill creates for persons to have access to justice. The fear of, or the notion in the Cayman Islands where if you ever want to take somebody to court, you have to have big money, created this attitude of people being lackadaisical with how they handle persons' legal rights in the Cayman Islands. I think this law will force us all to tighten up our belts, so to speak, because at this particular point, a person could be penniless and be able to have the opportunity to hold somebody accountable for their damages financially. Again, I'm going to give my full support to this, and I thank the AG and the Legal Reform Commission. This is so timely in a day and age like this, and I'll be honest with you, I wish it was 5 years ago, because there's so many people who have been unable to get their justice. But interestingly enough, I'll close with this, Mr. Speaker. I think this may have been a resolution to another problem that I was planning to bring to this Honorable House in respect to land disputes and beneficiaries of wills, whereby the law does not protect them well enough, and persons who did not have the opportunity to take the controllers of a will or the administrators of a will to court due to lack of monies now have that option. So maybe I could feel less burden to say if the administrators are not doing their job, they can now hire a lawyer and say, listen, these persons can be held responsible. I won't get into the details of that because it's not related to this bill, but this helps in other areas as well. So I thank the Attorney General and this administration for bringing the bill forward, and I will be supporting it. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Proceedings are suspended until 2:15 p.m.